You pay attention with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street.
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is Modern Love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is Only a Game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Epps.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
It's slightly intimidating to come up after hearing everyone that you listen to daily on the radio. Good evening. My name is Chris Grimley. I'm a principal at Over Under. We're an architecture and design studio in Boston. I am the author of Heroic Concrete Architecture in a New Boston and Imagining the Modern Pittsburgh and the Emergence of the Renaissance, which is not the title because I'm slightly nervous because I'm here. I only mention those two things because Lizabeth Cohen contributed remarkably to both of those projects, and I think we're lucky to have this new book, Saving America's Cities, an examination of the project to unearth the mythologies and dispel the mythologies surrounding urban renewal through the lens of Edward Logue. I'm going to read the things that BUR want me to read, which is welcome. If you like what you see here tonight, share us on social media at WBUR City Space. There's a full lineup online. You can sign up for a monthly events newsletter at the kiosk in the lobby. Elizabeth will do a little bit of explanation as to why this book exists, which is a remarkable document about this particular part of America's history. And then we'll have a short conversation. There'll be a mic to take questions, and then afterwards there'll be copies of the book, which Elizabeth will be happy enough to sign. So without further ado, I'll invite Lizabeth up here to talk about her book. Thank you.
I can't even see you with the lights. And I know a lot of you. Well, maybe my eyes will adjust. Let's put this down. Well, thank you for coming, particularly given the weather today, which we didn't plan on. I'm very excited to be here, to be celebrating the launch of this book, which anyone who knows me, I've spent a lot of time working on. And so thank you for joining me. So as I said, this book has taken me a long time, approximately 14 years, which was delayed, as many of the people in the audience know, by being dean at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And that was indeed a delay, but it was also an inspiration on many fronts because I think it encouraged me to write for a broad public. I want to start by giving you some background on why I wrote this book. I'm not a biographer. I'm a social, political, and urban historian of the United States in the 20th century, and this is a very different kind of book than what I have written before. You might well ask why I've written a biographically oriented book about a powerful white male city builder like Ed Logue. I first decided that I wanted to write a book on post-World War II cities that grappled with the changing physical built environment as well as how that came about. As I put it in the book's introduction, I aim to understand who's in charge, who should have a say, who benefits, and who pays the bill. I determined that focusing on the life of somebody who was personally engaged with the struggle to revitalize post-war American cities in a period when mass suburbia was booming would be a promising way to frame the book and to engage audiences, readers, I hoped, in an important story. In my earlier work as a social historian, I was writing the history of groups of ordinary Americans, first and second generation immigrants, factory workers, African Americans who traveled from the American South to northern cities, middle-class homeowners and consumers, and so forth. This kind of history is often called history from the bottom up. In this book, I became attracted to a new challenge of putting an individual with power at the center of my book, to write, if you will, history from the top down, but to bring to it the kinds of analysis that social historians are concerned with about social identity, class, gender, race and ethnicity, profession, and the like. In my previous book, A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America, I had written about the rise of mass suburbia as an increasingly important place of residence, work, and commerce after World War II. There I explored what I called the landscape of mass consumption, the carving out of new urban housing developments from farms and forests, and the rise of shopping malls at new highway intersections. In that book, I implied that cities were being displaced by suburbia, but that really wasn't my subject of investigation. So when I set out to write what did eventually become Saving America's Cities, I wanted to understand better what the decentralization of American metropolitan areas had meant for cities, particularly the older established ones that had thrived with industrialization and immigration in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. But now we're in decline. I also felt from the start that we had a very limited, quite simplistic understanding of how post-war cities had developed, based on essentially dismissing all efforts at urban redevelopment as disastrous urban renewal. That assumption seemed to equate all interventions with the work of villains like New York's notorious Robert Moses. And in contrast, the ideal for post-war cities was thought to be best articulated by the more saintly Jane Jacobs. Anti-planning, hands-off, let cities develop organically on their own. Surely, I thought, the story must be more complicated than a clash of these two very opposite caricatured positions. I certainly knew that urban renewal from the late 1940s into the 1970s had deep flaws, and I'm here referring to things such as the demolition and dislocation of neighborhoods and dislocation of residents who too often were African Americans and minorities, a problematic belief in the importance of separating residences from work and from retail, the imposition of suburban car-oriented schemes on downtowns, highways that slashed through neighborhoods, and more. But on the other hand, I also knew that many American cities were in deep trouble by the 1940s and in need of help. After a decade of a Great Depression in the 30s, followed by the deprivations of wartime, cities were bleeding people, jobs, and more to the booming suburbs. My final motivation in writing this book was that as a city dweller and a city lover, I was increasingly alarmed about what I was seeing around me. The shocking deterioration of urban infrastructure, as well as a worsening crisis in affordable housing almost everywhere in the United States, to the point where low-rent apartments are very fast disappearing, evictions and homelessness are growing, and more than a third of American households are paying over 30% of their income on shelter, and in many places, large numbers of people are paying as much as 50%, if not more, just to shelter themselves and their families. Moreover, a drastic divide has developed between cities that are flourishing and cities that are failing. So we have haves and have-nots among cities, not just within them. So I wondered, how did we get here? I also wondered, where were the resources that once had made the US a country with a highly functional mass transit and well-engineered, up-to-date roads, bridges, and tunnels? And where was the commitment that had led the nation to at least assert in the Housing Act of 1949 that the country had a responsibility, and I quote, to provide a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family, end quote. Might there not be something to learn from probing how we got to this place? So why Ed Logue? I started looking around for an ideal subject for my book, and I had a checklist. But most importantly, I was looking for an individual whose life would allow me to tell two intertwined stories, both how a person and a nation went about trying to revitalize American cities and the mutual influence they had on each other and on American cities. It didn't take me long to stumble upon Ed Logue. I had taught a course at Harvard in Boston history, and so I knew from that about the influence he had had in the 1960s in turning around a long deteriorating Boston. Soon, however, I got the good news that Logue had left an enormous cache of papers at his alma mater of Yale, that he had given many interviews over the years so that I could hear his own voice, even though he was no longer alive, that no one else was writing a book about him, that matters, and that many of his associates from the cities where he had worked were still very much alive, in touch with each other, and had in fact launched a website called Friends of Edward J. Logue. His friends indeed proved a tremendous resource to me, and I was also very fortunate, I should say, that Ed Logue's family was still around, supportive of my book without being intrusive, which is very important, and generous with their memories, their contacts, and family papers. In time, I would figure out that the span of Logue's career offered me an amazing way to track shifts in urban redevelopment over more than 4 decades. As Logue worked in New Haven in the 1950s, in Boston in the 1960s, in New York State from the late 1960s to the mid-1970s, and in the South Bronx from 1978 to 1985. In the last 15 years of his life, he taught courses at MIT, came back to Boston, he taught courses at MIT, he ran a small consulting business, and he tried unsuccessfully to write his memoirs. He was a doer, not a writer. Ed Logue died in 2000 on Martha's Vineyard at the age of not quite 79. So why is Ed Logue a compelling protagonist for this book? Logue grew up caring deeply about cities. He was born in 1921 and raised in Philadelphia, one of 5 children of a widowed kindergarten teacher without many financial resources. He went to Yale College on scholarship and then to Yale Law School on the GI Bill, where he became deeply engaged in the city of New Haven, particularly with its working class residents, many of whom he knew from working in Yale's dining halls as a scholarship student, and whom he later helped organize into Yale's first labor union. When Logue married Margaret Devane, who was the daughter of the dean of Yale College, his roots in New Haven grew even deeper. And I paint a portrait of Logue as a very complicated figure. He was loved and admired by many, and he was deeply disliked by others. And from his earliest days, he was most comfortable, I suggest, as a rebel in the belly of the establishment beast. Those are my words, not his. But I saw that repeatedly over his lifetime, he made his way into bastions of power, and then he fought hard to improve what he judged to be their damaging deficiencies. Logue became committed to renewing cities as part of his liberal progressive politics. And this really does run counter to many assumptions we have about who urban renewers actually were. We often portray them as part of a pro-business growth machine that put corporate investment over people. Logue stood in stark contrast to that stereotype. He worked as a labor organizer, as I mentioned, and here he is with his labor button, and he trained as a labor lawyer. He fought McCarthyism and discriminatory quotas at Yale. He argued strenuously that white, not black America had a race problem to overcome, and he had no illusions that the private sector would do anything but put private profit over the public interest. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Logue thought the problems of cities should be the next frontier of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and that extensive federal dollars and expert know-how should now be applied to the challenge of saving America's cities. And a typical comment of Logue's was, the public sector created the new Boston, and the public sector must control it. Logue also learned early in his career that physical improvements in the built environment could have larger social and political benefits, and he discovered this in a quite surprising place. He was serving as special assistant to Chester Bowles, who was the American ambassador to the new nation of India in the early 1950s, and he had been a former New Dealer himself. Many of you may know he ran Roosevelt's Office of Price Administration during World War II. And there in India, Logue observed the US government and the Ford Foundation investing deeply in what was then called community development, improving physical infrastructures of villages, roads, wells, schools, housing, in hopes of creating a more equal, democratic, and remember this is the Cold War, anti-communist India in the midst of this very intense period. Logue subsequently brought lessons from what was then called the Third World, now we call it the developing world, back with him to his work in first world American cities. And this is not the direction of influence that we generally expect. Logue's time in the developing world was only the first example of how he learned from and participated in a transnational circulation of ideas about architecture and planning. And this was very common after World War II. He was also inspired by European social housing, and later in his career by the creation of European new towns, which was a strategy that many European countries undertook to rebuild after the devastations of World War II. Upon returning from India in the fall of 1953, Logue began a career in urban redevelopment that would unfold in 4 acts over 4 decades. And in the book, I follow Logue's personal story and watch this urban renewal process unfold and argue that it was not at all static, but that rather we see many, many changes over time. We see him experimenting with different approaches in response to his own admitted failures, as well as shifts in national policy and politics, and implementing some surprisingly progressive ideas. So urban renewal in this telling is not the one huge disaster of popular lore, I would say, but a much more complex evolutionary response to American cities in crisis. Now, I'm not going to take you through all the details of a half century of history, but there are some highlights that I want to draw your attention to in Logue's 4 acts in renewing cities. The first act was in New Haven. From 1954 to 1961, Logue was there. He teamed up with a newly elected reform mayor, Richard C. Lee, to try to turn the city that was in very big trouble around. Old industries were closing. Many successful companies were abandoning their original home, which was leading to the disappearance of many good working-class jobs. This was happening just as African Americans were arriving from the South with hopes of making a better living in the industrial North. At the same time, middle-class white Americans, residents of New Haven, were moving to the suburbs in search of newer housing, better schools, and other aspects of modern living, and in some cases quite explicitly because they saw New Haven becoming increasingly non-white. And finally, the new I-95 highway threatened to bypass downtown New Haven. And this they saw as a potential death knell for the city's role as the retail center of this region. And they were already facing growing competition from suburban shopping centers. So the important point that I want to make here is that cities like New Haven were truly in trouble. Logue and Lee's agenda consisted of using newly available federal funding from the Housing Acts of 1949 and 1954 to make New Haven a national laboratory for physical renewal, as well as for innovative social programs. Many of them, like Head Start, neighborhood legal services, job retraining, would make their way eventually into LBJ's Great Society. And in the end, New Haven got more dollars per capita from the federal government than any other American city, and it was widely viewed as ground zero for urban renewal. Lee and Logue had some notable successes, but I would say that overall, this first phase of federal urban renewal turned out to be deeply problematic in New Haven as well as in most other cities, for reasons that I go into, obviously, in the book. Most egregiously, the urban renewers here and elsewhere tore down a poor but still viable low-income neighborhood to put up apartments that were aimed at keeping the middle class in the city and a highway to connect downtown to I-95, and they introduced a very car-oriented, suburban-like shopping center into downtown. I also probe the way that urban renewers consulted with community residents, and I discovered that although people like Lee and Logue and those they worked with felt that they were democratically minded experts who were protecting the public good, their approach sought input mostly from representatives of established interest groups and community organizations. And I call this approach in this period pluralist democracy, a term I borrow from the analysis of Yale political scientist Robert Dahl, who wrote a very famous book called Who Governs that took as a case study the urban renewal of New Haven. So I conclude that phase one of urban renewal during the 1950s, with its massive clearance, which you saw on the previous slide, was deeply flawed in New Haven as well as in many other cities. And here in Boston, for example, the immigrant West End was leveled in much the same way as we saw as this happened in New Haven. So Act Two is Boston from 1960 to 1967. Logue is here. In 1960, he was first hired as a consultant, and then he became permanent head of a newly expanded Boston Redevelopment Authority. He was hired by another new mayor, John Collins, who had ambitions to turn around his own near-bankrupt and politically paralyzed city. In Boston, Logue learned from his mistakes in New Haven and those that had taken place under the previous Boston mayor, John Hines. And so Logue came in waving a slogan of planning with people and vowing never to undertake the kind of demolition that had destroyed the West End. In my Boston chapters, I examined two dimensions of Logue's work in Boston, downtown and the neighborhoods. The heart of downtown's urban renewal was the creation of Government Center to revitalize Boston's stagnant downtown, to greatly expand jobs there, and to pressure a reluctant Yankee business elite to finally commit to the city that it had been ignoring for decades. Instead, it was the elite business people were investing elsewhere, and they were fighting Boston's Democratic Party machine under James Michael Curley from the Massachusetts State House. The government story, center story, is a fascinating one. I won't go into a lot of detail now, but I just want to mention that here Logue, and here you see a change underway, here Logue came to recognize the importance of preserving some of Boston's historic structures, like the Sears Crescent and Quincy Market, to create a mix of historic and modern buildings. And I think we could say that that still characterizes Boston today. He also learned that he needed to broaden the base of support for his program. And so he sought a range of influential allies, including the Catholic Church, newspapers like the Boston Globe, influential retail leaders like the presidents of Jordan Marsh and Filene's, local architects, and integrationist-oriented Black middle-class people in Roxbury who had limited neighborhoods where they could own homes, and in fact, they welcomed Logue with open arms. Logue's efforts to revitalize Boston's neighborhoods, on the other hand, were much more contentious than downtown. But in the end, Logue learned that just as it had been necessary to negotiate between the modern and the historic, so too he had to negotiate with key neighborhood groups to achieve his renewal goals. And I look at 5 Boston neighborhoods that he focused on: Washington Park and Madison Park in Roxbury, Charlestown, the South End, and the North Harvard area of Allston. What I discovered is that every neighborhood had its own story. Attitudes towards class and race played very important roles in all these neighborhoods, but the outcome proved much more complicated, varied, and unexpected than the common assumption that urban renewal can simply be reduced to middle-class white people grabbing neighborhoods from lower-class Black people. Moreover, I argue that over the course of these years, neighborhood residents developed important skills of negotiating with city officials through what a participant observer MIT graduate student and later a professor at MIT, Langley Keys, at the time called the rehabilitation planning game. Ultimately, Boston's citizens would apply these skills to gaining more affordable housing and, very importantly, defeating the Southwest Expressway and the Inner Belt Highway projects in the 1970s. Communities' experience of fighting urban renewal in the 1960s, I suggest, contributed to a new expectation for what a democratic process in city redevelopment must entail. As in other social movements, and this is actually from the North Harvard area in Allston, as in other social movements like civil rights, anti-war politics, feminism, grassroots participation became a requirement in cities. And so what I call participatory democracy, in contrast to the pluralist democracy, was a big shift from the expectations for what it meant to engage a community in the 1950s. Logue was widely credited with bringing about the city's turnaround as the new Boston, but his Boston years ended with another surprise for me: a failed effort in 1967 to run as mayor of the city when Collins announced that he was done. It soon became clear, however, that Logue was better suited for the administrator's back room than the mayor's front office. He turned out to be a terrible campaigner. But he also suffered from a 10-person race where the front runner was school segregationist Louise Day Hicks, and her presence encouraged the sort of liberal opponents of her to rally around Secretary of the Massachusetts Commonwealth, Kevin White, who did become Boston's next mayor. Act 3, New York State, where Logue spends the years of 1968 to 1975. This next act came about when liberal Republican governor, if you can even imagine those words together anymore, Nelson Rockefeller, was frustrated with the difficulty of getting New York State voters to approve bond issues to construct much-needed subsidized housing. So he came up with a workaround: a statewide urban renewal super agency with enormous powers, and he hired Ed Logue to head it. It was called the New York State Urban Development Corporation. It was called in short, the UDC, and it was funded by an innovative combination of state appropriations, dwindling federal dollars, and, in a unique move, bonds to be sold to private investors. In recognition of the difficulty of doing this job, Rockefeller gave the UDC and Logue enormous authority, including the ability to acquire property through eminent domain, and most unusually and quite controversially, to override exclusionary local zoning and outdated building codes. Getting the New York State Legislature's approval, as you can imagine, for a UDC that would challenge local zoning proved extremely hard to secure. And it only came quite reluctantly when Rockefeller argued at the moment of Martin Luther King's assassination that New York needed, quote, a true memorial made not of stone but of action. And I should also add that Rockefeller was very good at arm twisting. The UDC had many successes. It built 33,000 units of housing over its 6.5 years. It sought alternatives to demolition-style urban renewal by creating new towns on undeveloped land. There were 2 in upstate New York and Roosevelt Island, as many of you may know, in the East River of New York City. And it planned these new towns to be intentionally mixed income, mixed race, and mixed age. And it experimented with innovative architectural designs and building technology, such as creating a prototype for a low-rise, high-density alternative to high-rise public housing. The UDC also became an important leader in affirmative action hiring in New York State. But the UDC came tumbling down when Logue tried to build modest amounts of affordable housing in 9 well-off Westchester suburban communities. That shouldn't be a surprise. What he called a fair share housing program. And then when then-President Nixon turned off the federal spigot and implemented a moratorium on all spending on federal spending on housing as part of his new federalist agenda to reduce the role of the federal government. As a result, the UDC came to a dramatic collapse with a major default on notes and loans. Logue was forced to resign, and he did so in great anger and frustration. The final act, Act 4, takes place in the South Bronx from 1978 to 1985. Logue became president of something called the South Bronx Development Organization, which was for short SBDO. This was Logue's last major urban redevelopment job. Here, he sought to rehabilitate himself after this spectacular failure of the UDC, and also at the same time to rehabilitate one of the poorest areas in the nation. And he did this with his tools he had much less power, fewer tools to work with, and a smaller amount of funding than he had ever had before to deal with, enormous problems. Nixon's cut in federal appropriations for cities and housing continued under Carter, and then it took a huge dive under Reagan. Between 1981 and 1987, federal housing programs were slashed by 2/3, more than any other part of Reagan's budget. The federal government was going out of the business of supporting urban redevelopment, and in its place was actively promoting private market solutions. As president of this small, scrappy SBDO, Logue constantly was scrambling for resources. And once again, he shifted his strategy out of necessity and he was often looking for ways to work within this new orientation to private market solutions. His signature program was Charlotte Gardens, which were 90 ranch-style, prefabricated, single-family homes that were constructed in the middle of one of the most troubled neighborhoods in New York City, Charlotte Street. They were heavily subsidized for purchase with the goal of attracting lower middle-class homeowners to anchor the revitalization of the neighborhood, and then multi-family rental housing was expected to follow after. To the surprise of many naysayers, Charlotte Gardens proved a huge success, with hundreds of Black and Puerto Rican Bronx residents, transit workers, security guards, fire and police, nurses, teachers, eager to buy the kind of suburban-style home that they either couldn't afford or wasn't available to them as people of color in New York's mostly lily-white suburban communities. A few aspects of the SBDO period I think are worth mentioning. First, here Logue clearly and regretfully abandoned his previous prioritizing of innovative architectural design in favor of a conventional style that he felt would appeal to prospective local buyers and private funders. Secondly, Charlotte Gardens and other SBDO housing in the Bronx ultimately provided a blueprint for the more extensive 10-year Koch housing plan that followed, which would actually create several 100,000 units of housing in New York City over a 15-year period. And third, and most notably, after a long career of paying lip service to his mantra of planning with people, here in the South Bronx, he actually did it, working closely with community planning boards and neighborhood CDCs like the Mid-Bronx Desperados, because he came to recognize how necessary they and their constituents were to achieving any success. So let me conclude now and just give you make a few points that I think one can take from this book. First, over time, Logue learned a lesson that many liberal do-gooders in other policy areas learned as well, that the work of the urban redevelopment expert, a profession that he enthusiastically helped create in the 1950s and the 1960s, had serious limitations. More grassroots participation by community members was necessary if there were going to be real solutions. But how that should work to avoid NIMBYism or to narrow a focus on one single corner of the city remains a challenge, I think, for cities today. Minimally, we should learn from this history that planning for a neighborhood or even on the scale of a city requires that all interests be at the table, government officials at all levels, planners, architects, private investors, and particularly residents. Secondly, although Logue's career, throughout his career, he struggled to figure out ways of doing two things that proved very difficult for him, and they still are very difficult for us today. First, how to create socially diverse communities by income, race, and age. He felt that was the best insurance that low and moderate income Americans, who were often minorities, could have to assure that they got decent and equitable services, schools, transportation, retail stores, and the like, as well as greater social opportunities for them and for their children. In a society like ours, where your local residence often dictates your future life chances, and middle-class whites are often better positioned to demand the best, Logue promoted socially integrated communities. But he frequently lacked the tools to do this. And I think still today we struggle, for example, with how to keep existing residents in gentrifying neighborhoods, how to provide sufficient numbers of Section 8 vouchers for low-income people who do want to move to better served communities, or how to bring to a much larger scale the requirement that developers of market-rate housing must include affordable units. Second, the other hard nut to crack for Logue was how to involve whole metropolitan areas in solving the housing, schooling, and other problems facing low-income city residents. Logue fruitlessly tried to raise this subject in New Haven and Boston, and he hoped when he got to New York State, he was finally sitting in a position where he had some sort of authority statewide that he could make this work, and of course, that didn't happen. It ended with the downfall of the UDC as well as himself. And I would say that metropolitan problem solving remains mostly elusive today. Third and finally, probably the greatest disappointment and disillusionment in Logue's career was a decline of the role and responsibility of government, particularly at the federal level, for financing and revitalizing cities and subsidizing affordable housing. Over his career, Logue watched federal support steadily shrink and responsibility shift to the private sector, a serious mistake, in his opinion, that forced cities to make deals that in the end cost them future tax revenues. They put undue burdens on public services, and they often led to races to the bottom between cities where in the end they all lost out. As Logue said towards the end of his life, and I quote, "The basic responsibility for subsidizing housing for the low and lower income families is federal. It is everywhere in the developed world, used to be with us," end quote. And most importantly, even if we acknowledge that urban renewal at its best was the proverbial mixed bag, I think we can still, and we should, admire and seek to recapture that spirit of commitment and experimentation that propelled people like Logue, rather than just content ourselves with accepting the limited palette of possibilities that has come to dominate since the 1980s. As I say at the very end of this book, my last sentence, this would be the legacy of urban renewal that Ed Logue would want us to honor, and that he would consider the highest tribute we could pay to his lifetime of public service, imperfections and all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lizabeth, for that great talk. I would also like to thank you personally for this book. It does seem, it came in the mail when we were doing this, and I was like, oh my goodness, what are we...
There's a lot of footnotes at the end.
There's a lot of footnotes at the end, but...
Not as long as it looks.
It reads really breezily. Like it is a very, and it could be that I'm a target audience, but it's also, I think, a remarkable piece of work that now is sitting very heavily on the table. So thank you. There's a lot to sort of go through in this, and I think for me in particular, and for those of us who have been kind of become invested in unpacking the legacies of urban renewal, particularly when it comes to the city of Boston, I think there is like a real sort of pleasure in the minutia of day-to-day activity that Logue was doing while he was here, whether it was like walking through the entire city and coming back to the mayor. There's an anecdote that's sort of marvelous where the mayor is like, I could have done that. And Logue is like, well, then I've done my job. I walked through, I understand, I've come in as an outsider, and I get here. But I think too often we end up, as you've mentioned at the beginning, in this very kind of black and white comparison between the villain and the angel, the villain being the Moses and the angel being Jane Jacobs, and we lose a lot of the nuance. So maybe you could just talk about your discovery process in here, and one of the things that we're really acknowledging in our project, which we call Heroic for a reason, is that every hero has an Achilles heel, and that no story is singular. It has multi-facets to it. So
that's I think a good question, and it's a lot of years to think back on to remember how I started off in this. I think just by inclination, the black and white story from the beginning seemed too simple to me. It just didn't make sense, and I knew there was likely to be more to the story. I think one of the struggles that I had in writing the book is that I had to weigh identifying with him as my protagonist and also recognizing all the other interest groups and individuals who are in this story. And I hope that I, in the end, give a sense that he was a flawed person, that what he did had many imperfections in it, but that there also were some very important ideas that we seem sadly to have kind of abandoned as possibilities. That, it really was a surprise to me to find somebody in the 1950s and 60s really talking about wanting to create communities and neighborhoods that were mixed economically and racially, where they would intentionally put senior citizen housing on Roosevelt Island so that it would be a huge age span, as they put. They also had daycare centers in many of the buildings so that there would be sort of income and age mix among the residents. There really was a kind of an openness to try to, what he was proud to say was social engineering. And today, for I'm sure a multiple of reasons, we shy away from that. We think we can't, that somehow that things have just developed the way they do, and we really can't intervene in that way. And I think that's really tragic, because we give up kind of these important social aspirations.
Yeah, and honestly, I think your comments about the diminishing role of government and the increasing sort of language that's used against this period sort of dovetails into that in a way.
Yeah, so somehow we have this sense that somehow the market is going to determine what happens, and there's no place for intervening in that. And that, this is not unique with me. There's a lot of analysis of this enormous change in Americans' mentalities from a kind of liberal New Deal orientation to building a strong social welfare state to a more neoliberal orientation where the expectation is somehow the market is always right and it will determine, and there's not much you can do to change that.
Correct. I think that there's also a parallel track here, which is about how other cities responded or even did their own renewal projects. And we've talked a lot about the Pittsburgh model, where you had Richard Mellon working very actively with the mayor to I got that wrong, didn't I? No, I did.
No,
I got David Lawrence. David Lawrence is the mayor. Richard Mellon.
Definitely.
There's so many names that float around here, but in Pittsburgh in particular, the Renaissance was driven by an intense public-private partnership that almost is a precursor to a lot of the work that's happening. In Boston, it wasn't that way, and I think you alluded a little bit to some of the politics that were going on.
Yeah, I think that the role of elites in Pittsburgh versus Boston are really important in that story. That in Pittsburgh, where I lived when I taught at Carnegie Mellon for my first job, I loved Pittsburgh, lived there for 6 years. But there was this ethos among the creators of what was called the Pittsburgh Renaissance that the private sector had done it all. Yes, it was a partnership, but mostly it was, Heinz, Alcoa. There was Pittsburgh was a U.S. Steel, was a big corporate headquarters. So to some extent, there were big companies there, and there was an elite that was very invested in that city. But they also exaggerated, I think, the extent to which federal money and resources they exaggerated the extent that were not part of what happened. And then you've done a lot of work on it. Chris and some of his partners did a really wonderful exhibition at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh on urban renewal in Pittsburgh, and then organized these sort of community conversations that they called salons, where they brought people like me and others to come and talk to local people about their own sort of memories and responses to the kinds of changes that had taken place in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, exactly. And I think part of this project, and you and I have talked about it a lot, is this, and you alluded to it in some of your introductory remarks, or even in the acknowledgments, is the opportunity. We're now in this moment where we have an opportunity to get we don't have the main protagonist per se, but we have the people surrounding the main protagonists, histories, oral history projects, collecting their memories and voices. And I have to say, having done this for about 15 years now, if I have the memory at 80 or 85 that some of the people that we've been interviewing for our project have, I will be delighted. And I'm just, I'm wondering about your own.
Long-term memory is better than short-term.
I can't even remember what I did like a month ago, let alone what I did 2 decades ago. But maybe there's something there about the urgency of
recording these
recorded
voices.
Histories and recording the voices that might be lost to time.
I interviewed or had substantial conversations with about 100 people, I would say, over these years, and learned a huge amount. And actually, sometimes I would walk out of those interviews and think, God, I didn't really learn anything new there. But when I went back to write, of course, I found this wonderfully rich material where I could have people saying things, not just my own sort of words, and it became extremely helpful. And hopefully, it brings real characters, real people to the book. But when I went back, when I was writing the acknowledgments, I went back and tried to reconstruct all the people that I had talked to. And in the acknowledgments, there's a list of all these people. And it was a rather poignant moment. Because a lot of the people I talked to are not alive anymore. I interviewed people who were on oxygen tents, on oxygen, machines, people who were, not in good health at all, but who felt that they had done this work with such idealism. And that's one of the things I want to really try to convey, that, this was sort of part of being in that moment in the 1960s of, Kennedy, and this feeling that, we could make the United States a better place, a more equal place. They had this tremendous, feeling at the time that they wanted to do this work. And many of them could have made, they were trained as lawyers, they could have made plenty more money, but they wanted to do the people's work. And then, as the history got written of urban renewal, they felt, more and more diminished in what they had done. And it felt like, such a disjuncture, and that nobody really cared about what it had felt like to be part of that history. And so when I would come, sometimes I could never even get out of there, but they gave me so many things. Like many of them had held on to important reports, a big important sort of plan for Boston, in the South Bronx, this huge red book that was the plan that Logue started the project with, photographs. I would walk out of many of these interviews with all kinds of stuff, and it came in extremely handy when I came to write. Now I have to figure out, of course, what to do with it all. But there is, for New Haven, anyway, the manuscript and archives at Yale have Logue's papers, they have the New Haven Redevelopment Authority. Boston does have materials at the Boston Public Library and the Boston City Archives. The UDC papers are in the New York State Archives. But, this stuff is all over the place. And I have to figure out what to do with my interviews. Whether they were transcribed. I got some grants to help do that. Anyone who's done it knows how expensive it is to get the interviews transcribed. Mm-hmm. But they're not in great shape to be deposited in a library. I have to do a lot of correcting.
Right. I think having with the salons, like taking 10,000 or 12,000 or 15,000 words and bringing it into something that is digestible is difficult at best.
Because in the back of this book on Pittsburgh, there is a transcript, and you're suggesting quite an edited one, right, of these salons, which are quite interesting.
But I think you're alluding, there's something here, and maybe we can open it up to the audience after this, but we are at a moment in this particular country's history where it seems like we're either at we're at a cliff edge or we're at a pivot point, and just day to day, who knows? But I think there's something. Do you think we can somehow resurrect the good of the project? Is there a way to is there something that we can take about the optimism and the aspirational kind of ideals that Logue was projecting in the work that he was doing? Is there something that we can do about integration and resuscitating this? You alluded to it earlier in your remarks, that so much of even a middle-class income is going towards just shelter. Like, do you think, what can we do with this particular book and bringing it
well
now?
It's a
tough question.
Big project, but I think it's basically a political project. Until there's kind of a different attitude towards the role of government in Washington and among Americans. I do think one of the things I feel most sad about is this, I think, an incredible change in the way Americans look at government, particularly the federal government. They see all the mistakes. That's part of the sort of narrative about urban renewal, as look what government does, tears things down. There's just so people, have dwell on the negative aspects. But personally, I think that the federal government is potentially, not necessarily now, one of the most important instruments of economic redistribution that we have in this country. But we have to make it work for us. So I think it's basically a political project that there are many, as many of you I'm sure have read, that whatever's happening today is often happening at the city level. There are very good mayors, people working for cities who care and who want to change the situation, but they don't have a lot of tools to work with. And in most of what you can do in cities to try to accomplish many of these goals is to just squeeze as much as you can out of the private market and out of private developers, and have linkages and whatever fees that you can then use. But we know where it goes. I mean, so I thought it was really tragic when Amazon played cities against each other to see who would be the bride. And they were just, cities felt no alternative but to give away all kinds of things. Now, ultimately, the story had a very interesting ending where the community in Long Island City said, no, thank you. And now it's obviously in Arlington, and we'll see how that goes. But, they were taking full advantage of where we're at today, with just assuming that it's all in the hands of what we can get out of the private sector.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting parallel, because if you took the amount of labor that went into making each one of those plans, and we were approached multiple times to help clarify communication strategies and everything, and we were just like, no, thank you.
But you were approached by the city of Boston?
By various cities in New England. Yeah, but I mean, the amount of labor that was given to that, if you turned it on its head and gave it back to the public good, we would be in a much better position. I mean, I take comfort in the fact that people that have either worked for us or worked for the generation of architecture and design firms that I'm a part of in this community, the younger generation have actually gone to what is now the BPDA and are very young and very energetic and are invested in trying to make the city better from that sort of grassroots level.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. One of the events I'm very much looking forward to is in early December, I'm going to speak to a full staff meeting of what was the BRA, now is the Boston Planning and Development Authority, because it is their history.
Right.
And I'm very pleased that they recognize that and asked me to come and to talk to them.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try and sneak in on that one.
Okay. So should we open it
Absolutely.
up to any questions? There's
Sure.
a mic there.
Can barely see, but there's a question over here.
Can you just... Yeah, that's fine.
I'm Tom Palmer. Thank you for persisting for 14 years.
Give you this one. Give that back to him.
So much.
Fate of the West End was pretty much fixed by the time Ed Logue came here,
but
I just wondered if he lost sleep over that, if he worried about it. What was his reaction, even though he couldn't do anything about it?
Well, that's a very good question. He wanted nothing to do with it. And when he came in, there was a big I write about this in the book, there was a big conflict because there was somebody in the job of heading this much smaller BRA, a man named Kane Simonian. And Kane Simonian, I think I see there are people here who recognize the name. Kane Simonian was furious that Collins was bringing this outsider Logue in and that he was basically being demoted. He brought a suit, which was ultimately dismissed. But one of the compromises they made is that they would both run a different part of the operation. Basically, Kane Simonian ran things that Ed Logue didn't care about, which included the West End. And Logue was happy to be rid of it. But he still was frustrated by it. He had actually had interactions with Jerry Rappaport in New Haven, and so they had a lot of conflict here in Boston just getting things to happen there that Logue wanted. But a man named Alex von Hoffman, who's written a lot about Boston, knows a lot about housing, told me an interesting story where years ago he introduced Logue at a session of national planning meetings. And he asked Logue what he'd like him to say about him. What's the little bio I should give? And Logue's answer was, just tell them I had nothing to do with the West End. Barry. Yeah, right.
Barry Bluestone. Wow, that's just fabulous work, Liz. I wondered if you cover in your book some of the other changes that were going in Boston after the West End, the redevelopment of the whole Prudential Center, and of course the very important thing of stopping the Southwest Highway coming through in the Southwest Quarter.
Right, and I do, of course.
Could you speak about those a little bit and what role he may have played?
Yes, the Prudential Center issue is very important. That too, Hines had started. Hines had started the West End and the New York Street projects in the South End. He also was working on trying to get the Prudential Insurance Company to build its headquarters here in Boston and its regional New England headquarters and government center, but things just never came together. So Logue did inherit all these projects, and he actually made it, the problem with the Prudential Center had been that the city could not assure the Prudential Center what their tax liability would be going forward, because they were not in a position to be able to make a project like that an urban renewal project where they could have that kind of control. So Logue made it actually one of the conditions of accepting his position that the state legislature would allow the railroad yards that was the site of what would become the Prudential Center, an urban renewal site, so they could have much more control and deliver to Prudential what they needed to deliver. So he was really crucial. But one of the problems, and this had been thought out before he came, and I can't say that he would have done any better in thinking this through, but one of the problems with the Prudential Center and downtown was that it split the retail district in a city that's not that large at a moment when suburban retail is booming. And so the high-end stores all then migrated to the Back Bay and into the neighborhood of the Prudential Center, and downtown Crossing just struggled and struggled and struggled, and anybody from Boston knows what happened there. So that, there were definitely mistakes. I mean, they were happy to get the Prudential Center, but it ultimately was not as constructive as it might have been.
I think the expressway. I've been starting to pull out a thread here, which is Madison Park School, which is the only Breuer project in the city, and the circumstances are like basically that project is a 15-year build from when it was
Campus High School you're talking about?
Campus High School, yeah, Madison Park. And I think there's like a really interesting thread to be pulled between the antagonism against the highway, which is entirely justified, and the antagonism against the school, which is entirely not. And I've been working with a number of the constituents that were part of that process to try and figure out how they all weave together.
Thank you very much, Liz. You invoked Moses and Jacob sort of as poles of urban thinking at the beginning of this. And I'm really interested in what Logue himself thought about the two of them. Did he see either of them as his inspiration or his nemesis, or how did that go?
Well, that's a good question, and I do write about this. Let's start with Moses. He knew him a little bit. They both were Yaleys, and they both liked football. And they would run into each other at football games at Princeton and Yale. And actually, Moses was from New Haven, so he was a local boy. But Logue was really quite critical of Moses. He admired some of what he did. The recreational facilities, and many people would say that Jones Beach and many of the parks that Moses built, even if they hate Moses, they'll acknowledge that those were very important contributions. He hated this high-rise public housing. Logue never supported public housing, and he particularly hated high-rise public housing. But he was much more he was aware himself, and other people were aware, that Logue had much more of a social vision and a social commitment than Moses had. And Moses, interestingly, as Logue was kind of star was rising in the 1960s, Moses's was declining. And he got wind of the fact that when John Lindsay was elected mayor in the 1960s, he tried to recruit Logue to New York In the end, Logue didn't go because Lindsay was unwilling or unable to give him the kind of power over planning and redevelopment that he had in Boston, and he didn't think he could do as much as he would have wanted to. So he turned down the offer. But Moses was very threatened about the idea that this guy Ed Logue was going to be brought to New York, and he wrote to somebody he knew in Boston and said, "Tell me about this Ed Logue. What's he done in Boston?" And the person he wrote to wrote back and said, "Actually, he's done a very good job here," which was not what obviously Moses wanted to hear. So I would say that that Logue was quite realistic about Moses. He had admiration for his ability to do these big projects, but they didn't share a lot of the same values. So with Jane Jacobs, it's a lot more complicated. They had a famous debate at the Museum of Modern Art that was written up in The Nation and in other places I write about this, where they really went after each other. And you know, the irony is that over time, I think that Logue absorbed a lot of Jane Jacobs' message, and I think that Jane Jacobs' contribution is not to have a plan for the future. There's no plan there. There's no way of providing for infrastructure, for really doing anything, but that it was an important critique. And the critique worked for Logue. I mean, over time, he came to recognize, you know, many of the things she was saying. That, you know, that the importance of a street life, you know, that people need to be involved in these decisions. I mean, over time, he did get there. But they were great rivals, and at the MoMA, one of the funny things at the MoMA debate is that he surprises her and says that he went to her block in the West Village at 8 o'clock at night, and he didn't see any eyes on the street. It looked pretty dead to him, which is, of course, her big, you know, sort of point about the ballet of the sidewalk and the, you know, eyes on the street. So, you know, they kind of went for each other, but there was a funny, she was interviewed by somebody later on, and she was saying all these horrible things about Logue. He's, you know, and she put him in the same company with modernism, which she felt just tries to destroy what was there and invent everything over again. And she believed in kind of the layering and all that. And so the interviewer said, "So, do you think Logue is like Hitler?" And she said, "Oh no, so we were lucky." You know, I mean, she had some perspective on this.
We can't bring up the Life magazine quote, can we?
The Life magazine quote? Which one?
The Kathleen Craven.
Oh, well, she thought he was like...
She thought he was Hitler.
Yeah, Catherine, there were two people on the Boston City Council who really had it out for Logue, and one of them was Kitty Craven, from South
Bill Foley
Boston, and Bill Foley was the other. But there was a fabulous photograph, which I have in the book, that was in a feature on Logue that was in Life magazine that shows a picture of Kitty Craven kind of going after him.
The article is titled "Men, Projects, and an End to Despair, the New Boston."
Oh, okay.
But anyhow, there's the caption. The caption
Yes,
is,
the caption, because the article was called the Logue the Gladiator or something like that.
Yeah. And
Any other questions? Yes.
Surgery by Quack was Bill Foley's one. I think we have time for one last question.
No, I haven't. I mean, the book just came out. I mean, today or yesterday.
Yesterday.
So yesterday was the official publication date. I'm a member of the West End Museum, and you know, maybe somebody actually did write me and say, you know, I'm going to try to work something out, but I never heard anything. But you know, the book is just getting out, and I imagine that they will be. But I do think that, you know, I hope the West End was such a disaster for Boston and such a terrible example of the very worst in urban renewal. And it did cast a shadow over much else that happened, some of which was really positive. That's one of the points I want to make. And so we do have to make distinctions. One of the people I interviewed was a man named Frank Del Vecchio, who grew up in the West End. His father was a peddler. He was very emotionally upset when the West End was destroyed. He was a real local kid. He went to Boston Latin, then English high school. He then went to Tufts and he became a lawyer. But he worked for Logue, and when the Charlestown case is one of the most dramatic community pushbacks, and you can read about that in the book. But the first public meeting they had was a complete disaster for the BRA. I mean, the people were just screaming and saying, get out of our town. Interestingly, Frank Del Vecchio went to Logue after the meeting and said, you can still have Charlestown. I know how to do it. Let me do it for you. And he took a very different approach than what they were doing before. But what was interesting to me is this is a person who had all the scars of, the West End, and yet made the distinction, saw the difference, and saw that Charlestown was really pretty disastrous as an urban environment and really needed help.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming out.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, well, honestly, thank you, Lizabeth, for writing this book. It's been a real pleasure to read.
Nobody is as happy to have this book out than me.
And there will be books out in the lobby. Lizabeth will be out there to take more questions and praise on it. And thanks very much.